for the great conference, also for the other speakers. I really enjoyed listening to your talks. And indeed, as Geza highlighted, I'm based in the Netherlands in one of the alt protein hubs, lucky me. And the reason why I'm indeed talking about the corporates today is we've heard so many great examples in the past 3.5 hours. I hope you still have lots of energy left for my talk and the other talks following. But I think we wouldn't have been here today if it wasn't for all the startups and the research organizations and the nonprofit organizations focusing on this field so far. But that's not the only, those are not the only companies active in this field, but because also the corporates are getting a more active play in this area. And we believe from Bright Green's side that they will even play a bigger role later on in the future as well in the hybrid meat space, and also in general in the cell-based and fermentation-based space. Today, I'm mostly going to talk about large food companies and FMCGs. Here and there, I will give some other corporate examples, but it will mostly be dedicated to FMCGs. My talk will last for about 20 minutes, so if you have any questions, then feel free to drop those in the chat, and I'm happy to take some time afterwards to answer your questions, or otherwise connect with me on LinkedIn and we can talk further there. When I was preparing this presentation, and also with regards to all the talks that we've heard today, I was thinking that we talk so much about the future of hybrid meat products, but actually the concept of hybrid, as also David Brandis showed, is not new. We are familiar with hybrid in other industries, but also with hybrid already in the traditional meat industry. So what I've done is I've selected a few of those examples to give you a better understanding of what that means and how it failed and succeeded, before I dive into how the role from there looks like in the future for those FMCGs. So looking at some of the traditional hybrid products, and with traditional hybrid products, I actually mean animal-based products combined with vegetables. So not the plant-based textured proteins, but actually vegetables such as carrots, mushrooms, and onions. The examples that I show here on the slide have been created mostly by large meat manufacturers and other corporates, but also food retailers. The examples here listed are coming from the Netherlands, but we have examples from many parts of the world, such as the States, as well as Northwestern Europe, European countries and companies active in those areas. All of the examples here contain about 50, 60, 70% of animal-based proteins, and then are enriched with vegetables. They have succeeded in food service, some of them, but most of them actually failed in retail. Why is that? I already told you a few seconds ago that it is enriched with vegetables, and this is exactly the thing that the consumer does not really like, not necessarily because of the taste, but rather because of the concept and the positioning of this word and the certain products. They have the feeling that once they buy products that are enriched with vegetables, they do not really get the value for their money, because they perceive meat oftentimes as more valuable than vegetable products are. Therefore, all of these products are not on the shelves anymore in retail and food service. Some of them you can still find, and that is the reason because at food service, consumers do not really see the ingredient list. They rather buy into a concept. Let's say they buy just a total burger with French fries, and the burger patty is just one part of the total product that they will consume, or the total meal they will consume. So there they are a bit less picky about how many percentages of vegetables are already in there or not. And that's exactly also the thing that in the best practice example I will now show you is the case. Consumers are not aware that this product actually contains vegetables compared to the other non-vegetable containing product that Becker's has. Becker's is a brand in the portfolio of Good Life Foods. Good Life Foods is a large snacking company in Europe, mostly for deep frying, so not such healthy products compared to the name Good Life. And they have brought light snacks into the market, so you could also call them diet snacks. The thing is that those products still contain meat, but they are called diet or light snacks because they contain 30% less fat. Why is that? it is basically because they took about 30% of the meat out and included mushrooms and onions instead to give still the texture and the juiciness and the bit of umami flavor. But no one knows, unless if you would really compare the ingredient lists of those two, then you would see that actually a bit of the pork content is taken out and that there's only chicken meat left in the ingredient. But in this case, consumers actually perceive it as more valuable that there's less fat inside because of the limitation in animal-based protein. But basically, that's not being highlighted. And this is not the only example in Europe, but there are also examples from, let's say, Tyson Food in the US, which has focused on kind of the same USPs. You could also state sometimes less carbs or other USPs, but 30% less fat is about something we see on average in those type of products. But this is all focusing on traditional hybrid meat products. So products that contain still animal-based products and then added with just some vegetables, but not the really techy products as we talk about mostly today during the conference, where we actually look into already plant-based proteins, which are texturized and then added with cellular, let's say, fat to give that juiciness and the texture that actually plant-based meat is oftentimes still lacking or not as good as compared to the animal-based product, and which many consumers are still missing when they consume these type of products. Therefore, the large food companies and FMCGs are also looking into that field. Let me go to the next slide to give you an understanding of that. And by the way, shout out to the great pictures from both Meatable on this slide and also on my first slide that I showed from the Celiac Society. I think it's just great that we also get a bit of a better understanding of how these celiac facilities look like than just imagining how techy it could be in the facilities. The current focus of corporates, and not only from the FMCGs or food companies, is mostly on investment and closely watching the industry. Because as we see also here today, most of the developments are actually coming from the celiac companies, which are oftentimes startups. Many large meat companies such as Tyson, Cargill, PHW, but also biotech companies and technology companies like Merck and Mitsubishi have already invested in the cellular agriculture space. They want to be really close to the heat when this market takes off, but also to stimulate, of course, or to empower this industry to move faster. Other corporates, such as the FMCGs, are closely watching this space for developments, for the right moment when they actually step in, or whether it's a threat to their current plant-based business, for all sorts of reasons. But that's for today. And today, of course, we all know that celiac and therefore the hybrid products where celiac is part of, or fermentation-based could be part of, is not there yet at a full scale so that many consumers can buy it on the retail shelves. Therefore, we are rather looking at the potential future focus of corporates. And we definitely see from the Bright Green perspective, important role that they can play there. Because what we currently see is that these celiac companies are rather working isolated, not that they do not collaborate with each other, but everyone is working on a very specific part of the supply chain. Let's say on the creation of the fat or on a certain technology or machinery to actually being able to produce such components or products in the end. Many of the startups have, of course, been watching Impossible Foods, but also Beyond Meat and all their developments. I already heard someone saying today that it took about 8 years before Beyond even got into the shelves or had a product that could be launched. It takes a lot of time, R&D, and therefore work and therefore money to be able to create such a company that can both develop all the components that finally create such a product, but also to do the investments and to build up the facilities that can actually produce such products. Therefore, many of these celiac companies, because it even gets more technical related in this space, work on specific parts. But with all those very specific components, we of course do not get to a final product that is ready for consumption for consumers. On the other hand, we also see that the corporates, they are closely watching the space, are investing, but they have limited access to technologies and the knowledge that is needed to create such hybrid products or fully cellular-based products in the end for the consumer, to be able for them to include it into their branding portfolio and actually sell it under one of their brands or a totally new brand. That is why we at Brightwing Partners have taken learnings from the car manufacturing industry, where you see a lot of original equipment manufacturers, the OEMs. In the car manufacturing industry, it's also not the case that BMW produces all the components and other brands, all the components of the cars by themselves. So let's say you have the wheel, and you have the doors and seats and all the motor and all the tiny components that have to build up the car so that it actually is able to drive on the road in the end and is safe. They do design specific parts for themselves, which makes it the BMW in the end, but some of the parts are quite similar to other cars as well. What BMW does is they actually assemble and bring everything together so that they have this BMW ready to hit the road in the end and that they can brand it. But it's not the case that they are fully owner of all those components and producer of all those components. This is exactly something that we also envision for the hybrid production, but also in general for cellular agriculture production, because we do not see all the companies that are currently working on the technologies and the inputs and the products to finally create an output which is ready for consumption totally by themselves. We envision that there is this alliance partner needed or the assembler that can create these type of products. And that's precisely the role we envision for mostly FMCGs, but also other large food producers that work, for example, as private label or white label producer for many retailers or large food companies. Now, if you are an FMCG or a large food company, you of course think, okay, that's very nice, becoming an original equipment manufacturer, but how does that work if this industry is still rather undeveloped? That's why we have created a framework at Brightwing Partners, which enables to continuously track and update these supply chains. Because of course, with hybrid products, there are many supply chains being involved. So you have to look at several areas to continuously be up to date and to know which state the total industry are of the hybrid product creation to obtain in the end this OEM role. So starting at the first step of this framework, which is a guidance for the FMCG, is the supply chain mapping. If we look at plant-based, cell-based, and fermentation-based, and perhaps we should even, or perhaps I think we should even add the fourth pillar to this, based on Mulek's story, is to map the total supply chains from upstream and downstream, to make sure that you have it from the crops where you start to all the way, and that depends, of course, on the type of supply chain you're looking at, which steps are being involved, but all the way from the first input to the technologies required, to production and the pre-treatment and all sorts of things being required to actually produce, in the end, a certain output. But that's still a rather high level, because if you would already take, for example, within plant-based meat, a certain texture to create plant-based proteins, then there you already have certain variations of technologies you can use. So even every step within a certain supply chain can have several options to create such an output that you require from the certain input that you have. That's why we, after step one, suggest to not only have the map ready of the supply chain, of all those supply chains, but within the subcategories also make the deep dive into development curves. Development curves show you or give you a good understanding and a holistic overview of the certain stage in which a technology, but it can also be created for a certain product or even map companies next to that or ingredients in a specific space. I will give an example on my next slide, which is also the final slide of this presentation, so that you have a better understanding. It, in the end, is the objective that you have a good understanding and can continuously track at which stage the industry is, not only on the high level, but also on the deep level. Because if you want to work with, let's say, cellular-based inputs and with plant-based inputs, and you want to create at a certain scale, as an FMCG, because you do not produce just 10 products, but you want to go for 10 millions and etc. products to be able to serve certain clients of you, such as food retailers. Then you would have to look at both similar level of skills, because you could not include the same amount of, let's say, cell-based fat if you only have a certain amount of liters, if you need 10,000 of liters actually to be able to include it in the plant-based developments. So you would have to look at apples and apples instead of pears and apples. After you have that into a good overview, so you have the supply chain mapping and you have the development curve as an FMCG, then you might want to consider how deep you actually want to be involved into this space. And with that, we mean you have to decide on the amount of control and ownership and investments you actually want to make based on how deep you want to be into this industry. Then, based on that, if you want to be deeper into this industry and be closer to actually being able to include it into your production, then you can start acting, and you can either do that via make, buy, or ally decisions. I think it was David Welch who also said that today, that we will most likely see more acquisitions in the future, and also larger companies that will be able to tap into those technologies then to enable them into their own facilities. I hope I said it right now, David. But we will see way more of those buy options or actions from larger food companies in the future. Also make, of course, but for that they would need to have a lot of internal R&D and the right people to actually be able to make these developments, as we already see how hard all the startups are working to make this happen. And lastly, ally, forming partnerships to overcome these mismatches in the supply chain and to accelerate this supply chain to be able to create such final products. And also with all these steps, you have, of course, certain degrees to what extent you want to go into, let's say, a partnership, because you can do a partnership as an FMCG only for distribution in the end. But if you really want to have this OEM role, then you would need to have some further investments and even perhaps work on R&D topics together with the startups or the partner you choose to work with. Lastly, when all these 3 steps have been taken, then we suggest you continuously update this, because as we see, 3 years ago, we wouldn't have been talking about these topics what we talked about today, simply because this industry is moving so fast. At Bright Green, we really see this more as a mid to longer term opportunity, meaning that from 2025, we will see more developments, but really from 2030, it will be at larger scale. Also within the plant-based space, of course, we see that it evolves every year and it accelerates. So therefore, we really suggest the large companies, FMCGs, to continuously track those developments and to update specifically the development curves, so that you know when it's the right time to act as this OEM role once the industry is at large scale enough for you to act upon it and to include it into your product portfolio. And we believe that this framework will be the basis for FMCGs to start working into the hybrid space and already evaluate to what extent it is possible to move further into the space. Lastly, what I'm going to show you is what I, of course, promised, an example of a development curve. This is one that we use within Bright Green for the plant-based texturizing of plant-based meat texturizing. Some of you might be aware of this. In general, we split this into 3 stages: R&D stage, scaling phase, and commercialization. And like I just said, to being able to create hybrid meat products, you definitely want those technologies and also type of ingredients to be in the same stage, ideally in the commercialization stage, but you could already, of course, step in when it's at scaling stage to do the initial tests and pilots with that. But if you would work with an R&D combined with a commercialization stage, then it will be hard to provide final products on the shelves to your clients at a certain scale. In general, if we look at their plant-based protein texturing technologies, then we see that low moisture extrusion, high moisture extrusion, power heating are mostly commercialized. So those products are mostly being used right now in the industry, although they are still at a bit of a higher price if you would really compare those to other technologies in other industries. But those are really already being used at full scale. not diving too much into the plant-based topic because we're talking about hybrid, of course, today. If you have any questions based on my talk about the role of larger corporations and then mostly the FMCGs in hybrid meat, then I would be happy to answer those. I think we have a few minutes left. And if we do not have enough time, then feel free to drop me an email or to connect with me on LinkedIn.